A huge task lay before me. I saw its enormous size, and its value and meaning escaped me. I got into the dark, and I groped along my path. That path led inward and downward. The black books. There is no such thing as an unedited photo. There was a decision in the framing, the composition. There was a decision in when to release the shutter, how the camera should be set. A decision made in the mapping of the photo sites of the Bayer filter to what you were shown on the screen. The hue, saturation, and luminance of every single pixel interpreted from the raw data collected from photons interacting with the camera's CMOS sensor. That data itself biased by the framing. There was a decision in what to publish and what to discard, and a society surrounding it that decides on what to value. So to what extent can we call a photo objective? It is much the same in all the sciences, and so we should question them in the same way. Good evening. We are Obscura. We are here to shed some light on a different way of thinking about things, of thinking about us, our kind, to reframe all that has come before in a way that is hopefully beneficial to us all. Because sometimes simply changing the framing changes everything. So then, let's neuroqueer. The manifold Obscura presents Plurality, Neurodiversity, and Neurominority. As a cautionary warning, we do talk about mind, reality, spirituality, dissociation, and marginalization. This will include the marginalization of plurals, of autistic people, and of transgender people. While we may make mention of the kinds of things that might include, such as conversion therapy, we will avoid descriptions of any of those things. We have long blue and black dyed hair in several segments. We are white and wearing distinctive makeup and a dress covered in images of the moon in various faces. Collectively, our pronouns are she and her. We have suffered and survived conversion therapy and remain queer. We are psych survivors. We are disabled, mad, some of us ultra-human. We are plural, but do not claim to have DID, nor disordered plurality of any kind. To us, our plurality is more akin to a sense of spirituality, shrine keepers of madness, of wind and shadow. We have had the fortune of studying physics, as well as logic and the philosophy of science at university to a certain degree. While the skills developed there have proved useful, most of what is here is based on hard-won experience and independent, grassroots scholarship. We will deliberately avoid using the term system for plurals, and there are a few reasons for that. First and foremost, most plurals don't seem to use the word system to mean the same thing that science and psychology in particular does. In thermodynamics, we talk about open and closed systems, where the energy can transfer in and out of the system boundary. The boundary is arbitrary, but often chosen to naturally line up with some convenient thing to make the mathematics easier. Biology talks about the circulatory system, the endocrine system, the immune system, the central nervous system. Again, the boundaries are chosen out of convenience in order to talk about the mechanics of what is going on with some degree of clarity. So when psychology talks about family systems therapy, they are talking about the dynamics of that family unit and how they play out in someone's life. How someone impacting one member of that family will impact other members. When it gets to internal family systems, they tend to talk about it as parts or facets of a personality or self that works together to give rise to the self. More on that later. Just as the theory of structural dissociation talks about parts of various kinds that give rise to a fragmented self and attempts to explain, albeit poorly, why the dysfunction may happen in the way it does with psychotraumatic injuries. But when plurals use system, It's more a collective term, akin to family, or community, or cohort, group, or so on. So to switch between the two uses of the word in any argument would be equivocation, and should render such an argument unconvincing. If we were to use those same terms when talking about structure and dynamics, we'd end up talking about a system's system, and that's just unnecessarily confusing. We aren't here to gatekeep you on whatever terms you wish to use. That is up to you. But we do need to make the distinction for our purposes here. So instead of system, we will simply nominalize plural to plurality to refer to the collective group, not in ownership, but in relation to. For example, we are plural, me and my plurality, the Obscura plurality. My headmates are part of my plurality, as I am of theirs. So now, if necessary, we can talk about the plurality system and disentangle these ideas. Neurodiversity. First, we're going to have to start with some definitions since we see these terms get endlessly misused. Mostly by people who think that they're merely nicer ways to refer to people, but really these terms represent a different way of thinking. It's very easy to spot when organizations, researchers, and therapists have not done their due diligence and haven't bothered to understand because they mess these up all the time. And, as is the case with many terms and movements, we have seen many attempt to claim and shift neurodiversity as a tool for exclusion, but nothing could be further from the truth. So I don't blame any of you if you weren't aware of these, because there are a lot of people out there, either intentionally or unintentionally, undermining the neurodiversity paradigm to bring it in line with hegemony. Neurodivergent and neurotypical came first. Neurodivergent was coined to mean neurologically different from typical. Cassiane Asasumasu deliberately coined this term to be as inclusive as possible. It includes mental illnesses, it includes brain damage, and it includes things that are just a bit different from normal. This is her directly pointing this out 7 or so years ago. I coined neurodivergent before Tumblr was even a thing, like a decade or more ago, because people were using neurodiverse and neurodiversity to just mean autistic and possibly learning disabilities. But there's more, like way more, ways a person can have a different yet effing perfect dammit brain. Neurodivergent refers to neurologically divergent from typical. That's all. I am multiply neurodivergent. I am autistic, epileptic, have PTSD, have cluster headaches, have Chiari malformation. Neurodivergent just means a brain that diverges. That's all it means. It's not another damn tool of exclusion. It's specifically a tool of inclusion. If you don't want to be associated with those people, then you are the one who needs another word. Neurodivergent is for all of us. So plural is another term along the same lines as neurodivergent, deliberately inclusive with intentionally vague boundaries. It is very clear that plurals are neurodivergent, whether they consider themselves disordered or otherwise. It's not exactly considered typical to have a neurology housing more than one now, is it? But it turns out it gets a lot more interesting than that simple observation. More on that later. Neurodiversity was then formalized by Judy Singer. While many have tried to depoliticize it since, neurodiversity was enmeshed as a radical and political idea from the start. While the word itself does not imply anything particularly radical, as it merely names the biological fact about the diversity of human brains, it is tied up with the neurodiversity paradigm. The neurodiversity paradigm, put simply, states that difference is not necessarily disorder. This is a departure from the pathology paradigm, which does consider any divergence from normal as a pathology, a disorder. The neurodiversity paradigm does away with the idea that there is a normal type of brain. As a comparison, heterosexuality used to be considered normal and right within psychology. Gay people were disordered because they were different to heterosexual, but trans people were considered just so extra gay and disordered that they were too gay to function at all, to the degree that they got confused about who they were. I know I've put this in a light-hearted manner, but it isn't too far from what psychology actually believed really not that long ago. It wasn't until they started getting rid of these ridiculous and bigoted ideas about what was normal that they began to make any real progress on understanding and helping instead of harming our communities. That didn't come and probably never would have happened without community advocacy and activism, because all science is political, regardless of what they may claim to the contrary. And that's where the neurodiversity movement comes in. But back to plurality. In the words of Dr. Nick Walker, neurodiversity is the variation among minds, not just brains. This is where things get a little bit more intricate and interesting for plurality, because while it is obvious that a plurality shares the same brain, the same central nervous system, it's not at all clear that we all share the same mind. So in order to talk about that in terms of plurality, first we need to ask, what do we mean by mind? It was after reading her definition of mind that we really got intrigued because of what it implied. But first we wanted to make sure that we understood this concept of mind properly, to make sure we aren't getting excited over a misunderstanding. So we got the recommendation from Dr. Nick Walker to go and read Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio to better understand the concept of mind used in Neuroqueer heresies. Mind. All that I have, up to this moment, accepted as possessed of the highest truth and certainty, I received either from or through the senses. I observed, however, that these sometimes misled us, and as part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have even once been deceived. But it may be said, perhaps, that although the senses occasionally mislead us respecting minute objects, and such are so far removed from us as to be beyond the reach of close observation, there are yet many other of their presentations, of the truth of which it is manifestly impossible to doubt, as, for example, that I am in this place, seated by the fire, that I hold in my hands this piece of paper. Though this be true, I must nevertheless here consider that I am human, and thus, consequently, I am in the habit of sleeping, and representing to myself in dreams even those same things, or sometimes even others less probable. How often have I dreamt that I was in these familiar circumstances? At this present moment, however, I certainly look upon this paper with eyes wide awake. The head which I now move is not asleep. I extend this hand consciously and with express purpose, and I perceive it. The occurrences in sleep are not so distinct as all this, but I cannot forget that, at other times, I have been deceived in sleep by similar illusions. Let us suppose, then, that we are dreaming, and that all these particulars are merely illusions, and even that we really possess neither an entire body nor hands such as we see. Nevertheless, it must be admitted, at least, that the objects which appear to us in sleep are, as it were, painted representations which could not have been formed unless in the likeness of realities, and, therefore, that those general objects are not simply imaginary, but really existent. For, in truth, painters themselves, even when they study to represent sirens and satyrs by forms of the most fantastic and extraordinary, cannot bestow upon them natures absolutely new. Or, if they chance to imagine something so purely fictitious and absolutely false, it is at least certain that the colours of which this is composed are real. And, on the same principle, although these general objects, viz., a body, eyes, a head, hands, and the like, be imaginary, we are nevertheless absolutely necessitated to admit the reality at least of some other objects still more simple and universal than these, of which, just as of real colours, all those images of things, whether true and real, or false and fantastic, that are found in our consciousness, are formed. That's great and all, Descartes, but that's where I think you've gone a bit off the track in your meditations. But that's where I think you've gone a bit off the track in your meditations for what we're talking about, unfortunately. There is no need to regress to more rarefied things in order to talk about the experiences at hand. What is this mind thing anyway? Instead of going off delving into even more obtuse philosophy of mind texts and getting bogged down in arcane arguments over Cartesian dualism, we're simply going to keep it to the topic at hand with neurodiversity. But there is a bit more to it than brains and bodies. We need to talk about how the brain meshes with the body. As a text, Descartes' error lays out what the embodied mind is quite well, drawing quite a bit from neuroscience, but also in part from other fields as well, in order to tie everything together into something fairly readable. It is not without its own issues, however, but we'll get to one of those later. It sets the stage with the story of a man with a very particular form of traumatic brain injury, whereby he seemed to retain the entirety of his reasoning capacity, but thereafter seemed utterly unable to function in everyday life. No longer able to filter out information quickly, he became unable to decide on almost anything. Not only that, he seemed to have lost connection to certain bodily responses to emotions. He knew he would normally have a particular response to a particular stimulus, but no longer actually felt that way. While humans may think of reason as a particularly human thing to do, evolutionarily, it was built upon those structures that govern automatic reaction, emotion, processing vast amounts of information in moments in such a way that while it may make mistakes sometimes, it more often than not led to survival, a gut instinct, so to speak. None of these bodily systems exist in isolation. The circulatory system, the immune system, the central nervous system, the somatic, autonomic, and enteric nervous system, and so on. All of the bodily systems are in contact and communication with each other, not only via electrochemical signals via the nervous system, but hormone signaling as well. Systems upon systems all working together to regulate the body and provide the signaling and structure that gives rise to our experience of the world. It gives rise to our minds. But as changes in our body act upon our minds, changes in our mind enact changes in our brain and body, we can learn, think, and develop new things. Damasio draws a distinction between the bodily senses and the as-if loop, a kind of recreation that the brain does to mimic this sensory information. This is what happens when we call forth the mental sensorium. The brain presents this information in the way it best knows how, in attempting to recreate those states through prior experience with the body and the states those experiences created in the brain. We did note this qualitative difference between bodily senses and the virtual senses, the as-if loop, recreated by the brain ourselves in our presentation last year. When we experience the inner world, we are able to engage with it with all of our senses. We can see the environment, feel the grains of sand run against stone blocks underneath our fingers, hear the water, feel the temperature, sense time passing. It is not exactly the same as the experience with our external senses, but it corresponds to each. If these as-if feelings are updated and informed by the body, it might explain why dormant headmates are the way they are after they return. It would require some degree of embodiment to remain updated and present. Although a reminder that this book is 30 years old, so the details may be a bit off and outdated, but it can at least give us some sense of what it really means when we say that the mind is an embodied phenomenon. One issue that I know of for this hypothesis is that Wiley uses this lack of bodily update to account for phantom limb syndrome, where someone may lose a limb sometime after birth, but still have some sense that it is there. This same account does not explain aplastic phantom limbs, where the same occurs when the person never had the limb in the first place. Unless perhaps the mind also has some inherent map of the body that need not correspond to the anatomical form, but rather a form that it never embodied in the first place. Imagine that. Some kind of transhuman or alter-human. Anyway, even if you can't produce, for example, visual mental images, the brain still makes sense of them in its own way. It learns how to do this through its vast experience with this sensory information. It changes depending on what works with the sensory input and what doesn't work. This is all part of neurodiversity. In some sense, the mind is localized to the body but not confined to the body, while the brain is incoherent without the body, and the entire body and sensorium is important to the mind. External interaction is also necessary. Methinks one of the clearest indications of this is the impact of solitary confinement on mental health. So, what did Dr. Walker have to say about minds that had us so interested? Mind is an embodied phenomenon. The activity and development of the mind has a physical component in the form of electrochemical activity in the brain. The mind is encoded in the brain as ever-changing webs of neural connectivity. The brain directs bodily activity and at the same time is continually affected and shaped by bodily activity and experience. Mind is inextricably entwined with the brain and brain with body. Thus mind is inextricably entwined with the body in a single complex system and in a continuous dance of mutual shaping. We're not minds riding around in vehicles of flesh and bone. We're body minds. Bodies that think and perceive. Experience, awareness, sense of self, psychological development, and capacities for feeling, knowing, cognition, connection, and action are all entwined with and shape and are shaped by habits of bodily usage, including habits of movement, posture, breath, contact, consumption, tension and relaxation, gaze, gesture, and expression. If mind is an embodied phenomenon, it follows that a diversity of minds must also be a diversity of embodiments. Variations in neurocognitive functioning are entwined with variations in embodiment. Autism, for example, involves distinctive modes of physicality and sensory motor experience that are intimately connected with autistic modes of cognition. So when I say that neurodiversity is the diversity among minds, I'm really saying that it's the diversity among body minds. Perhaps you noticed what we noticed.
Plural embodiment.
To be plural is to be more than one in one body in some way. Those plurals with experiences similar to ours will notice differences between frontas and how they use and experience the body. There can be differences in posture, sensation, taste, eyesight, allergy, strength, mobility, memory, experience, awareness, sense of self, and so on. That is, each fronta has a distinct embodiment, an embodiment that can change drastically with a switch. Plurals aren't so much multiple personalities, nor multiple enactments, but multiple body minds. Body minds. Plural. All localized in the same space, the same body. As such, plurals display an incredible neurofluidity, to repurpose another term coined by Dr. Walker, such that one body-mind may, for example, have the neurodivergence of depression, but another does not. Such a thing requires a drastic shift in neurobiology and, well, to some extent biology in general, but it is something that some of us do with ease, naturally. Each member of a plurality is capable of having their own neurocognitive functioning. I am not suggesting that real plurals are those with true distinct selves. It is obvious to us that the vastness of the experiences of plurality are far more vague than that. What I am suggesting is that talk of parts, facets, fragments, and self-states are not enough to encapsulate the full range of the plural experience. It must also account for full selves, and even temporary selves. The ideas of neurofluidity, multiple embodiment, and multiple body-mind within a plurality are necessary inclusions in any credible understanding of plurality in general. Also required would likely be notions of ontological vagueness of embodiment and of body-mind, such that no sharp boundaries can be drawn between one and the next, but they are nonetheless different. The real kick in all is that psychiatry, psychology, and academia know this is a thing, but have relegated it as a symptom of disorder. The ISSTD guidelines talk about variation in things like physical ability, eyesight even, brain activity, and differences in galvanic skin response, a feature of the autonomic nervous system between alters. They know we have multiple embodiments, but have repeatedly chosen to delegitimize that. They know and they still decide to treat us the way they do. All because of their values, their ideology, their choice of framing. This gives rise to a very strange situation where the idea of some maximal embodiment exists, but only for a plurality. They make comparisons between body minds in a plurality to talk about what someone is really capable of, but never body minds in any other kind of collection. They know it makes little sense to use the body mind of an athlete as a standard for the maximal physical capacity of the body mind of a non-athlete, but this is exactly the kind of standard they set for the plurality. While yes, body minds in a plurality may have more similarities with each other due to the material conditions, they regard any body mind with lesser prowess than the most capable one as dissociated from their true capabilities, despite the neurobiological differences between those body minds. And just to highlight how pervasive these ideas can be, Damasio spends his entire book of Descartes' era talking about how emotions are felt in the body, and how the mind is embodied in various ways, and even including being embodied in a culture and society. He even talks about how foolish it would be to require medicine alone to heal a sick culture, just as it is foolish to ignore that aspect of human suffering and disease. Warnings about reducing the problems to the individual, but even with all that talk of mind, there is but a single mention of anything related to plurality in the entire book. The you in this episode is of one piece. In fact, it is a very real mental construction I will call the self, for lack of a better word. And it is based on activities throughout your entire organism, that is, in the body proper and in the brain. A sketch of what I think is necessary for the neural basis of self appears below, but I must immediately say that the self is a repeatedly reconstructed biological state. It is not a little person, the infamous homunculus, inside your brain contemplating what is going on. I must also point out that having a self, a single self, is quite compatible with Dennett's notion that we have no Cartesian theatre in some part of our brains. There is, to be sure, one self for each organism, except in those situations in which brain disease has created more than one, as happens in multiple personality disorder. Brain disease. Really? Is this just because it was in the DSM? How to spend an entire book laying out what mind is, say we have multiple selves, and then call that a brain disease? No, we know better than that, because this is what the medical model is. This is what the pathology paradigm is. That is to beg the question at issue. That is, if it is different from normal, then it must be disordered. And well, back in the days of SAS, if the individual didn't fit into normal society, then that individual either had a brain disease or a moral failing on their part. The problem could only ever be with the individual. This isn't an objective medical opinion, it's a moral one. This is a value judgment, it is a choice in framing. Very few of them dare look into the mirror for too long, lest they break the illusion. Okay. Now I want to talk to the psychologists, psychiatrists, academics, psychotherapists, and so on for a second. If you're using the word plural, specifically as a direct replacement for the terms DID and OSDD, you need to stop. Whether you mean it or not, when you equate these two terms, you are indicating that all plurality is disordered. This is pathology paradigm thinking, and it leads to very real and significant harm for plurals such as ourselves. We have experienced this personally, and it was life-threatening. This is also an issue with every single one of your diagnostics that we've seen so far. There is no space for someone to be plural, but not disordered. If you don't believe me, go look at the MID-60 and then ask yourselves how you could answer it in such a way that you could be any manner of plural, be aware of it, but not have the results clearly say, I have DID. It's literally the question category. This is an issue that you, psychs, need to account for. I am being insistent here because it is most vital that you, of all people, understand that the neurodiversity paradigm is a change in the way you think about and approach things, not just a change in terms. And well, you lot seem to be the biggest offenders in all of this. Maybe it's because of how your training conditioned you, the culture you're submersed in, who knows. But you need to be aware of the power you wield, not only interpersonally, but as potential agents of the state. But if you do change the way you think, you will end up with more clarity in seeing and assisting with the actual issues that your clients have. And you will lessen the risk of causing significant iatrogenic harm, either by your action or inaction. So have a think about it, yeah?
Neurominority.
Plurals are generally aware of these things from their own experiences, and is apparent in the use of terms we've occasionally seen used in the community with singlet normativity. Singlet generally simply meaning not plural, plural phobia or pluralmesia. This exemplifies a nascent understanding of plural marginalization. It is apparent that there is a tendency to favor singlet modes of being and single-minded modes of working. Even if you consider yourselves to be entirely composed of traumatic fragments, the way to overcome that requires genuine and lasting connection with others to serve as a stable base for healing, relearning. How can we do that when our environment is so atomizing, when all socializing and connection making is centered around the workplace, when all healing is relegated to the clinician? Perhaps we can build upon these ideas here using another term coined by Dr. Nick Walker, neurominority. A neurominority is a population of neurodivergent people, about whom all the following are true. 1. They all share a similar form of neurodivergence. 2. The form of neurodivergence they share is one of those forms that is largely innate and is separable from who they are, constituting an intrinsic and pervasive factor in their psyches, personalities, and fundamental ways of relating to the world. 3. The form of neurodivergence they share is one to which the neurotypical majority tends to respond with some degree of prejudice, misunderstanding, discrimination, and/or oppression, generally facilitated by classifying that form of neurodivergence as a medical pathology. Well, the first is easy to fill, it's already named in plural. The third is also a simple matter to fulfill. Plurality, often depicted as MPD, DID, a split personality, or possession, is a favourite explanation of the secret killer twist in movies, and before that it was a sensationalized case study exploited and published by psychotherapists. Those psychologists had a very strained relationship with ethics when it came to their clients, rather similar to how they treated trans people, to be honest. While the term plural has shifted in meaning and use over the decades, we have some reason to believe that it was used in some capacity to refer to the experience of plurality before multiple personality disorder was ever codified in the DSM-3. That is just the word plural. There is evidence that plurality as a phenomenon existed well before that in a variety of non-disordered forms, from a vast array of cultures, particularly viewed in terms of spiritual or the mythological. Also, interestingly, seem to be roles often associated with trans people, the trans feminine in particular for some reason. We would have happily filled this kind of societal role in another time and place, as priestess, shaman, seer, medium, miko, or the like. And in some ways we do. But unfortunately, we are here and now, and such a role is not so much recognized and respected. But psychology was at least forced to acknowledge this diversity with the shift from MPD to DID. They, nominally, no longer pathologized particular recognized religious experiences. It's a shame none of the diagnostics nor the psychotherapist training seems to take this into account. The second requirement of neurominority we might want to push back on a little if it were interpreted as present from birth, although we do note the use of the qualifier largely. Because while certain dispositions may exist, it might not make sense to claim that the thing itself is present. Such a claim might fall prey to neuroessentialism. And while, as far as we can tell, psychology seems to think that we are all plural, in a sense, from birth, but typically people stop being that way. We are not in a position to evaluate these ideas in depth at the moment, but given everything else we know about psychology, we have reason to hold them with suspicion. I suspect what they mean would be more in line with the internal family system's ideas about selfhood, and not so much in line with our neuroqueering notions of self. Besides, if our end goal is neurocosmopolitanism, then neither duration nor specificity nor innateness of neurodivergence should be required for authenticity of embodiment. The more crucial aspects of marginalization and barriers to neurocosmopolitanism are found in the impositions upon the marginalized, not in some essential quality of the oppressed. I don't think Dr. Walker would object to us pushing back against strongly essentialist characterizations of a neurominority. It is those forces of neuronormativity that often force us to conceal our neurodivergence even from ourselves as a form of harm reduction. But that this occurs as a symptom of that marginalization being present, even when the outward presentation of queerness or neurodivergence is not obvious. But it seems like biological dispositions still play a small but an important role. If the social constructivist models were absolute, then there would be little impetus to overcome the powerful forces of gender and neuronormativity. And as such, things like conversion therapy and applied behavior analysis would probably be more successful, but they aren't, at all. Meanwhile, biological essentialism also results in a homogenizing account. If everything were truly determined by our biology, then there would be no possibility of behaving in any other way. The social structures would arise out of biological necessity. But we know that's not the case, because those social structures change far more drastically than fixed biology would allow. In her book, Excluded, Julia Serrano elaborates on the idea she put forward in Whipping Girl of the subconscious sex in order to show how the tension of the social and the biological can create a vast array of diversity, whereas either explanation alone would more likely result in a homogeneous group. That while our biology does not determine our gender presentation and such, it may at least present a disposition towards relating to certain other people. These are not biological essentialist accounts, because while they do involve input from biology in the explanation, biology itself is not given primacy in the explanation. To borrow the idea from our friend Kat, the femme in yellow, we may form communities of practice, even if we do not precisely share the same gender or neurology, nor may those things present in the same way for cultural reasons. There is still some cross-cultural kinship that is available via these similar communities of practice, possibly guided by these innate dispositions, but not defined by them. I think what might be innate is a disposition to pluralize. Some of us might have a stronger disposition than others. Some have incredibly fluid structures, while others are more static. Some are more vague, and others are more solidly defined. But regardless of the plurality structure and dynamics, if present, plurality certainly is intrinsic and pervasive in our ways of relating to the world. In their paper, The Reality of Autism, Robert Chapman goes in depth on what kind of thing autism is, whether it is a mechanistic property cluster, a natural kind, a practical or psychiatric kind, a political identity, and so on. While the paper is worthwhile reading in itself, there were several arguments contained within that seemed notable to us in terms of plurality. What we count as, say, a horse, at any given time does not regularly fluctuate in relation to social norms and ideological shifts, but rather remains relatively stable. That autism isn't like this indicates that it may be a social kind, as opposed to a natural kind, in line with, on many accounts at least, female or queer, the boundaries of which seem to shift in relation to norms as much as natural findings. As we alluded to earlier, the shift from MPD to DID nominally incorporates the disqualifying criteria that the disturbance is not a normal part of broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. The ICD-11, meanwhile, specifically recognizes mediumship as being on the borderline of normality, and a circumstance in which the diagnosis should not be given. Both of the diagnostic manuals very clearly show that these diagnoses fluctuate very strongly with social norms and ideological shifts. However, a case study from 2016 found the DSM-5 criteria does not actually distinguish between DID and non-pathological possession. This is due to a loophole in the criteria where it does not take into account the context that the distress occurred in, and attributed it all to the individual themselves. It is the medical model of disability, the pathology paradigm, after all. We know this loophole well. We imagine it to be the same one used against us to justify conversion therapy. And as such, we consider such oversights to be the tools in maintaining psychiatric domination in spite of this recognized social dimension. So when we see published research talking about how their results were taken before the sociogenic phenomenon, like, I'm sorry, but that train left well before you were born. For example, from this paper published in March 2023. The data collection for the present study was completed by 2016. This is prior to what the proliferation of what Christensen 2022 describes as the sociogenic phenomenon of online presentations of people self-identifying as having dissociative identity disorder and/or as plural, whose presentation in history may be inconsistent with the traditional traumagenic dissociative identity disorder diagnoses. The present study is highly unlikely to include any participants with this sociogenic presentation. For participants in the clinical sample, their diagnoses were confirmed by their therapist. But future studies are advised to consider this issue in research design, as self-reporting of diagnoses and symptoms may not differentiate between those meeting diagnostic criteria and those who self-identify with the diagnoses, but who ultimately are false positive. They talk about this as a bonus, but it highlights a very distinct selection bias that is used to define all of us. There really isn't a time in history when such a statement could be true about the data being taken before sociogenic DID. The criteria itself necessitate DID as a social kind. Emily Christensen was being overly conservative at best in that paper, mentioning the plural community. And seeing how psychiatry, psychology, and the fields of trauma and dissociation view and treat plurals in general, and in particular those openly plural clinicians that don't toe the line, it's not very difficult to see why someone might be inclined to act and speak so conservatively. So many of those within the field with any authority seem keen to act as agents of hermeneutic injustice and maintain power through ignorance. But then again, power is the ability to afford not to learn. That's Carl Deutsch. Chapman's account of autism as a serial collective, then, was very interesting in light of all of this. Serial collectives are defined in light of shared external material factors that mutually affect each member of the collective, regardless of whether they may actually identify or not. For instance, all those waiting together for a late bus would form a serial collective, despite having no internal essence or shared identification. It seems to me that all neurominorities would have to be serial collectives, given that they are defined and positioned as lesser by the material conditions imposed upon them. These would be the forces that drive them to attempt to perform neurotypicality. But not all serial collectives would be neurominorities. Sanism and ableism impact all neurodivergences, but not all neurodivergences are considered neurominorities. While things like PTSD may have coincided with a change in the way some of us fundamentally saw the world, the PTSD itself was not inseparable from that change in worldview. Plurality, on the other hand, is inseparable, and we are worse off when our plurality is suppressed, just as we were worse off when we suppressed our genders for the sake of others. Plurals in general, and a particular plurality, both seems to form serial collectives. Those within a plurality are mutually affected by the material limitations of sharing a central nervous system. It would be when those members of that plurality recognize and identify themselves as members of that plurality that they become a group. The shared material conditions also readily explain similarities shared between members of the plurality, just as those within the same culture share similarities. There is no need to assume any overarching, underlying, or unifying self or mind to explain such similarities. Plurals in general are serialized by different material factors imposed upon them by society. As we mentioned earlier, we have heard the term singlet normativity increasingly used, and we shall formalize something to that effect in the moment. But in any case, I think it is at least subconsciously known to many plurals, and clearly very obvious to others, that plurality is a neurominority. And if the supplied definition of neurominority does not fit, it certainly seems fitting to adjust it. While we're on the topic of disorder and community views, it seems relevant to share some of our results from a poll we ran. While yes, this is a Twitter poll with the biases that come with it, the results really surprised us. The poll simply asks whether you consider DID to be a disorder with 17.6%, a type of plurality with 43.2%, a disorder of plurality with 26.4%, or something else with 12.8%. We expected, given our social sphere, that the majority would vote for DID being a disorder of plurality, but they didn't. In fact, the majority did not consider it to be a disorder at all, with comments indicating that they saw DID as a natural response, or that the issues commonly attributed to DID are seen as stemming from relational trauma issues commonly seen occurring between singular people, or trauma causing anguish for individuals within the plurality, not a disorder in and of itself, despite the name. The poll got far more engagement than we expected given our usual activity, so it seems to have escaped our usual sphere, but clearly didn't get into medicalist spheres. It is also worth mentioning that participation in the survey is far higher than many surveys we've seen done on even dissociative disorders in general. And they also deal with their own selection bias, usually only being done by the participant's clinician. I think there might be a tendency from academics and psychologists to look at these results and simply dismiss them as being woefully biased by malingerers and false positives, without thinking about what else it could mean, because that would imply something far worse about their own actions. Perhaps these people implying that DID is not a disorder really don't have DID. But let's think. Why else might they identify as having DID without us resorting to assuming bad intentions on their part? The explanation that springs to mind is that they recognized what was going on with themselves, looked around, and found the closest thing, the only thing, the most prevalent and authoritative thing that talked about any kind of multiplicity, was psychology with DID. I think that says more about the hegemony of psychiatry, psychology, academia, and the hermeneutic enclosure they all engage in, than it ever could about people seeking their own kind, their own communities of practice.
Singletism.
Since we've talked about it at length, let's formalize this marginalization, and to do so, we'll also draw inspiration from the works of Julia Serrano with her definition of cissexism. Cissexism, the belief or assumption that cis people's genders, identities, expressions, and embodiments are more natural and legitimate than those of trans people. Singletism, the belief or assumption that having a single unified identity, self, mind, embodiment, or singular modes of expression are more natural and legitimate than plural ones. With this construction, it's much easier to name what is going on with so many of these theories. They start with a normal, single person and extend out from there. The idea of what someone should be like, singular, and then try to work out what went wrong that they ended up at such an extreme. So where does this leave dissociation? Well, there's another reason we've juxtaposed cissexism and singletism. What does dissociate mean? To disconnect, to separate. When do I dissociate? Do I dissociate when I enter the inner world? When I meditate? When I sleep? Do we dissociate when embodiment shifts? Am I dissociated from you? Are you and I dissociated identities, dissociated self-states? Why don't we speak like this? Why does this sound so strange to say? We were already separate, you and I. We were never separated. You can only become dissociated from something with which you were attached, something of your own thoughts, feelings, your body. So why should I be forced to accept that the thoughts and feelings of another are my own? Isn't that something they teach? That you don't own and can't control the thoughts and feelings of others? So what sense does it make to say that we are dissociated if we have always been this way? We are not dissociated identities. We simply are. But if you come to a clinician, open as any kind of plural, and they have some experience with dissociation and DID, they always ask the question in the first session. And it seems that some guidelines suggest that they return to the question over and over again throughout therapy in the hopes that one day you give the answer they seek. While these may not be the words they use, it is clear this is what is meant by most of them. Do you want to be fixed or remain broken? You know the question. Is it in line with the neurodiversity paradigm? For over 100 years now, psychs of all kinds have used the ideas of repression and dissociation in order to undermine the legitimacy of trans people. Yes, I know these are technically different ideas, it doesn't matter here. The thinking was exactly the same despite the differences. If you hear stuff coming from the trans antagonistic groups, eventually you'll come across the sentiment that trans people are just dissociated from the reality of their bodies. This was not invented by them, but by the psychomedical institution and believed by them for decades. If you ever have the misfortune of reading psychology and sexology academic literature on trans people throughout modern history, and I really don't recommend you read it, they describe a lot of what is very clearly child abuse, you'll quickly learn that this idea is extremely prevalent, but never self-questioned. It is an idea that gives primacy to the apparent body that has been defined for us, biological essentialism. Which means, for them, the problem must lie in our self-concept. This is perhaps why it used to be labelled gender identity disorder in the DSM. Another identity disorder. They also knew that conversion therapy did not work since at least the 1960s, but asserted that they should attempt it anyway. They would also ask if you wanted to be fixed or remain broken then as well. The experiments of John Money, child abuser, when including the proper follow-ups, should have finally demonstrated how powerful these inherent dispositions of gender and the subconscious sex are. And yet, we still have psychologists talking about how trans people are trans because they are supposedly dissociated from their bodies. Perhaps part of this is because pretty much all of the dissociation-related diagnostics we've come across are also not at all trans-friendly. Nobody ever felt the need to go back and update them. Pretty much all of them would give elevated dissociation scores for trans people, and not because they were actually suffering from maladaptive dissociation, but because nobody ever considered how trans people would likely interpret the questions. Either you choose the framing, or someone else chooses the framing for you. In her chapter, Making the Shift to the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Nick Walker mentions that we must hold that the pathology paradigm is every bit as unacceptable as any other form of bigotry. And yes, this means almost all autism-related discourse and research produced over the past 90 years or so. I'm all for that. Up until the 1970s, nearly all scholarship pertaining to homosexuality framed it as a mental disorder, and professional practice was geared towards figuring out its causes, treating it, and/or preventing it. Sound familiar? In 1960, it would have been unthinkable to most psychologists to throw out every bit of scholarship and practice that stigmatized homosexuality and treated it as a pathology. And yet, over the past few decades, the academic and professional mainstream has done exactly that, and the results have been entirely beneficial. So dissociation research is flawed, but how does this gender talk relate to plurality? There was a paper that was published in 2022 about gender dysphoria and dissociative identity disorder that cited a swath of papers, many of them from the 1900s, including some from John Money, with comparisons between multiple personality disorder and gender identity disorder. In this paper, they very clearly considered any non-cis member of a plurality to be illegitimate of gender. They clearly did conversion or reparative therapy on these participants, going by any sensible definition of the terms. But they considered this okay, because they also considered those members themselves to be illegitimate. They only consider the host, whatever that means, as the real one. If you can't suppress the gender, then suppress the plurality, right? Cissexism? Singularism. No, you don't understand. These people aren't trans. They're just dissociated parts from... Hush. Hush now. Your kind have been using this argument for 100 years to justify the abuse of our kind. Just stop. You're all still way too comfortable with eugenics and genocide. Throw it out. A related consideration is when a person's entire experience of an oppressed group consists of situations in which the members of that group are in inferior roles. It inevitably shapes that person's perspective on the group in question. In my experience, the people who have the least empathy for autistic persons, the least ability to communicate respectively with autistic persons, and the least genuine openness to learning from autistic persons are the neurotypical professionals who have spent their careers working with autistic persons in situations in which the professional always holds the authority, and the autistic persons are always in the role of the patient, student, research subject, or recipient of services. That's Dr. Nick Walker again, in her article, Neurotypical Psychotherapists and Autistic Clients. And it's certainly true. And it also holds true in our experience for both plural and transgender people. Do you want to be fixed or remain broken?
Neuroqueer.
I want to acknowledge something very un-neuroqueer that we do, although in its own way it is harm reduction. While we do use the pronouns she, her collectively, and while many of us do find those pronouns fit best, not all of us do. Some even feel some discomfort at their use. But at the same time, we know that if we were to outwardly claim multiple pronoun sets, we would end up in a situation that is worse off, especially for some in our plurality. Many of us recognize the pointed they, often used in order to stealthily strip a trans woman of her pronouns. Far too few people consider it utterly unconscionable to strip the pronouns from trans people they are personally upset with. The authenticity of our identities are held conditional based on the whims of those with power over us. Ideally, we would simply be able to state something to the effect of, I am so-and-so of Obscura, these are my pronouns, without those becoming the name and pronouns used for all of us. But as it is, many doctors are already very overeager to take trans people off their hormone therapy for any reason whatsoever. And we currently have psychologists and academics manufacturing those reasons to deny hormone therapy to neurodivergent people out of claims of inauthenticity. And some may ask if Obscura is only sometimes a woman, but that would also be to mistake our plurality. To my knowledge, those of us who are women are always women, and those of us who are not aren't. We don't have anyone in particular that is gender fluid, nor underwent any significant shift in gender. But even if that were the case, that wouldn't be a reason to deny hormone therapy. We made these decisions as a plurality. Perhaps the subconscious sex is deeper than gender, but we know there are other plurals with vastly different experiences to ours. But regardless, it is this outwardly apparent transient nature of plural gender that leads clinicians to believe that we should be denied gender-affirming care just in case we change our minds. In his paper, Is Transsexualism Chronic?, Cassius Adair highlights that under our contemporary regime of medico-juridical authentication of identity, transness cannot yet exist without the idea of duration. A birth certificate, a name, a diagnosis, things legible to the state are made chronic in their designation. To be temporary or to be sudden is to be illegitimate and inauthentic. Ultimately, undoing the hegemony of diagnostic time, of juridical stasis, of transpathologization demands that we find ways to describe a gender's legitimacy other than by duration. What if I could say that I am now trans, or once was trans, without making an argument about the duration of my gender? A world in which I can narrate my gender as such would also necessitate accepting that some people might experience their genders in ways that, at this cultural moment, would be read as inauthentic and even deceptive. It would mean that a collection of people currently invoked as threats to our legitimacy claims can also be understood as having trans histories if they want them. Detransitioners and retransitioners, non-binary people across a multitude of identities, people who experience their internalities as part of a system rather than an individual mind, people who might have identified in an earlier period of trans history as cross-dressers, etc. These people are not trans, nor do they constitute proof of the flimsiness of trans identity, but rather the opposite. That transness is robust, omnipresent, and can potentially emerge at any time. These less enduring manifestations become evidence only that transness has multiple expressions, variations, manifestations on the body and in the mind. Of course, we don't see ourselves this way, but this is the way psychiatry and psychology tends to frame us, as mistaken fragments who have taken on an inauthentic trans identity and must be persuaded otherwise. Neither our multiple embodiments nor our trans embodiments are considered authentic or real, and one is used as an excuse to deny the other. Now, there's one last thing we wish to draw your attention to. In their paper, The Colonial Project of Gender and Everything Else, Dr. Sandy O'Sullivan lays out how gender is controlled by colonialism. Central to any exclusion in managing Indigenous peoples is asserting meaning and value by engaging markers to commodify not only the bodies of existing Indigenous people, but also past and future Indigenous people. This is present in a way that gender roles are reformed through colonial restrictions as a tool to align family and kinship structures so that they mimic privileged European family systems at the moment of first invasion. Through the construction of an exclusive and excluding ancestral relationship, this structure proposes relationships of meaning that relate only from progenitor to direct issue. The modern nuclear family, as a repeating pattern, is then privileged. This process, crucially for Indigenous peoples, replaces existing kinship structures with a linear view of relationships, family, and accountabilities to the state and to each other. That's right. This all feeds back into white supremacy. Psych and academia have been a part of this since the beginning. So maybe, just maybe, we should take care to deconstruct these family systems within ourselves. We know what needs to change, and very few are willing to give up a situation they personally benefit from. Very few are willing to cede power willingly. We are many, and we must build our own ways of being, our own ideas, our own spaces, our own legitimacy, our own power, in our own way. So go forth and neuroqueer.